You are watching part 20 of the full series of Java Spring Boot interview questions. These are the 5 questions we are going to discuss in this session. How can you implement data caching in a Spring Boot application using the Spring Cache Abstraction? How can you configure a custom error page in a Spring Boot application? How can you implement distributed tracing in a Spring Boot application using OpenTelemetry? How can you implement asynchronous processing in a Spring Boot application? How can you enable HTTPS in a Spring Boot application? First question, how can you implement data caching in a Spring Boot application using the Spring Cache Abstraction? To implement data caching in a Spring Boot application, you can leverage the Spring Cache Abstraction. Follow these steps. First, enable caching support by annotating your configuration class with that enable caching. Next, add the desired cache implementation library, such as ehcache or caffeine, as a dependency. Next, annotate the methods that should be cached with that cacheable and specify the cache name or key. Then finally, configure the cache properties, such as eviction policies and time to live, in the cache implementation's configuration file or using Spring Boot's properties. Second question, how can you configure a custom error page in a Spring Boot application? To configure a custom error page in a Spring Boot application, you can create a custom error controller and map it to a specific URL or error status code. Here's an example. Create a class implementing the error controller interface. Annotate the class with that controller and, optionally, with that request mapping to specify the mapping URL or error status code. Implement a method that handles the error and returns the desired error page view or response. Register the custom error controller as a bean in the application context. Optionally, configure the error page mapping in the application.properties or application.yaml file using properties like server.error.path or server.error.whitelabel.enabled. Third question, how can you implement distributed tracing in a Spring Boot application using OpenTelemetry? To implement distributed tracing in a Spring Boot application using OpenTelemetry, you can include the necessary OpenTelemetry dependencies, such as OpenTelemetry API and an OpenTelemetry exporter. Configuring the exporter lets you send trace data to a distributed tracing system like Jaeger or Zipkin. OpenTelemetry automatically instructs the application to capture and propagate trace information across different services, allowing you to trace the execution path of requests in a distributed system. Next question, how can you implement asynchronous processing in a Spring Boot application? Spring Boot provides support for asynchronous processing through the use of the @async annotation and the task executor interface. To implement asynchronous processing, follow these steps. First, configure a task executor bean in your application's configuration. This bean defines the thread pool or executor service used for executing asynchronous tasks. Next, annotate the methods that need to be executed asynchronously with the @async annotation. Finally, invoke the annotated methods from other parts of your application. The invocation will return a future object which can be used to obtain the result of the asynchronous task or monitor its progress. Next question, how can you enable HTTPS in a Spring Boot application? To enable HTTPS in a Spring Boot application, you need to configure the appropriate SSL certificate and modify the application's configuration. Here are the general steps. First, obtain an SSL certificate and private key. Second, configure the certificate and private key in the application's configuration, such as application.properties or application.yml. Using properties like server.ssl.keystore and server.ssl.keypassword. Then, set the server.ssl.enabled property to true to enable HTTPS. Next, optionally, configure other SSL-related properties like the SSL protocol and cipher suites. Finally, restart the application for the changes to take effect. Hope you have learned something and feel confident to answer the questions we discussed so far. Here is the list of questions that will be discussed in the next session. Please check out our playlist for more questions and subscribe our channel for updates and notifications. Good luck for your upcoming interviews.